Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to the second session of the Building Bridges talk series. I'm Alexis Alvarez-Nakagawa, one of the hosts of the series, together with Dr. Johanna Gibson, who is here present as well. And the Building Bridges series are co-organized by the Forum on the Centering the Human and the Global Epistemologies program here at QMUL. So in this session, Professor Lars Chittka will present his book, The Mind of a Bee, published by Princeton University Press in 2022, which draws on from decades of research on the behavior and cognitive abilities of bees. And he will do this presentation in conversation with Professor Johanna Gibson. So, Professor, you all know Professor Chittka, but let me introduce him. Let me fulfill my role of moderator here. So Professor Chittka is the founder of the Research Center for Psychology at QMUL, where he is also a professor of sensory and behavioral ecology. Professor Chittka is a recipient of several different awards, including the Royal Society Wolfson Research Merit Award and the award Advanced Fellowship from the European Research Council. He is also a member of the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina, an elected fellow of the Linnean Society, a fellow of the Royal Entomological Society, as well as the Royal Society of Biology. And he received the Lesley Goodman Award of Royal Entomological Society in 2006, if I'm not. So Professor Johanna Gibson is Herschel Smith Professor of Intellectual Property Law and also the Academic Director of the Intellectual Property Law LLM and the Deputy Director of the QMUL Intellectual Property Research Institute at the Center for Commercial Law Studies, or TCLS. Professor Gibson has published extensively in the fields of intellectual property, critical theory, and of course, as well, animal legal studies. So we are going to start with Professor Chittka presenting his book and his research on bees. After that, Professor Gibson will comment on how Lars' work has been influential for the intersection of ecology and legal studies. We are also going to kick off the conversation with some questions. After that, we'll open the floor for questions from all of you. So, Lars, thank you so much for being here. The floor is all yours.
Right. All right. Two logistic things. How much time do I have from right now? 35 minutes, 40 minutes?
Yeah. It's okay. That's
okay.
55, 40 minutes.
All right. And can I have a glass of water?
Sure.
All right. Sorry, I realized it's a late request. Anyway, so my challenge is to sit down while talking, which I have never done before, but I'll try my best, and juggling two laptops. So I guess I am. So this one is muted. If I talk to this laptop, can you out there hear me? It's fine. All right, good. All right. So yeah, I've studied the sensory system, the learning and memories and so on fantastic, thank you so much, of bees for a few decades, but surely it's still quite a big jump to go from talking about memory capacities and sensory perception to a mind. So what do I mean by a mind of an insect? So let me see where I can actually advance the presentation. So what I'll talk to you about today is the following ingredients of a mind. I'm going to ask whether bees could be said to have representations, mental representations of things and of space and of things in space. I want to explore whether bees have flexible access to the past and at least the immediate future, whether in contrast, to an hypothetical animal that is permanently stuck in the present, just responding to currently incoming stimuli, whether there is not just a memory, but actual flexible retrieval of past memories, and whether there's some sort of appreciation of things, the outcomes of things that I might do, and the results in the near future. And perhaps most controversially, I want to explore whether bees could be said to have emotion-like states. Now, we're all aware, I think, that social insects can do fairly impressive things in terms of their architecture, their social organization, and so on. And here we have two structures that, at least once you divide out the scale factor, look remotely similar. On the left side, a termite mound, and on the right side, La Sagrada Familia, a famous cathedral in Barcelona. And these are both very impressive architectures, but common thinking is that they come about by entirely different pathways in the human case versus the insect case. And in the human scenario, so common thinking goes, everything is top down. There is an architect who dreams up the final product. And then once he's got the complete plan, he hands down instructions to builders and engineers and so on. And they then put this already pre-planned product into reality. And conversely, so the thinking goes, in social insects, there is no such planning. Everything is decided by hardwired rules with which these insects already come prefabricated. They basically have everything they need to know inbuilt. And then as a byproduct of all these hardwired routines of lots of individuals, these magnificent structures emerge. And this dichotomy between the human and the insect case is something that I want to deconstruct a little bit today. The fascination with social insect and specifically bee architectures is quite old, unsurprisingly, given that, for example, the regularity of honeycomb is something extraordinary if you take a broader perspective all across the animal kingdom. That is, that if you, other than the human case, of course, but if you look at the things vertebrates construct, beaver dams, bird nests, and so on, they're actually, in comparison, quite messy affairs. Whereas the regularity, symmetry, and indeed the mathematical optimality of this bee honeycomb is something that's unparalleled in vertebrates other than us, of course. So it's a highly regular structure. It's optimal in terms of minimizing material use while maximizing stability, storage space, and so on. It's also double-sided, so there's no waste of space at any level. And of course, this has interested people for many centuries. And this Swiss naturalist, Charles Bonnet, for example, observed the following, or thought the following about this, how this structure might come about. He said, place together in the same room 10,000 automatons, animated with a living force, and all induced with a perfect resemblance of their outer and inner being. If we admit the least degree of feeling in these automatons, even only such as is necessary for them to be conscious of their own existence, seek their own conservation, avoid noxious things, prepare useful things, etc., their work will not only be regular, well proportioned, similar, equal, but it will also have symmetry, strength, convenience to the highest point of perfection. Now, this is a curious mix of these bottom-up and top-down perspectives that I mentioned earlier, because by and large, he's saying it is self-organization. He subscribes to a bottom-up kind of view, but refers to these things that he calls automatons. He takes it for granted that they're conscious, that they have feeling, and somehow that this architecture might appeal to their need to prepare useful things. So it's a bit of a blend of both perspectives. But it's quite clear that it's not as simple as just putting together 10,000 automatons in a common environment. So if you put 10,000 fruit flies or 10,000 laboratory rats, or indeed 10,000 baboons together in a common environment, they won't suddenly start building something, right? And so the first person to be interested in how this comb construction actually comes about was another Swiss naturalist, François Hubert, who experimented with his team with various observation hives into which, contrary to the sort of normally dark structure or walled, opaque walled structure, inserted glass screens to just explore what actually happens inside a beehive. And what normally happens, as those of you who are beekeepers, of course, know, is the construction starts at the ceiling, and then bees gradually work their way down using gravity as a reference, and until they've reached somewhere near the bottom. Then this two-dimensional sheet is basically completed. And the first thing that Hubert and his team found, the first thing they did when wanting to look inside the box without getting stung, is they put a glass ceiling. And they found that the bees didn't like very much to attach the foundations of their comb to the slippery surface that is glass. And so these are animations by Vince Gallo, who's here in the audience. This is obviously not a photo from a 200-year-old work. And so what Hubert and his team observed the bees did when there was a glass ceiling is they inverted the entire comb construction, built the foundations on the bottom, and then worked their way upwards, entirely inverting the normal alignment of the comb with gravity. And you might say, well, okay, that's still a sort of robotic repetitive structure where you need to repeat the same structure over and over. And maybe you're right, but the point is, had you built a machine to mimic the natural process, had you actually built a robot that uses the same rule that bees normally use, start at the top, work your way down, that robot would already fall flat on its nose with this simple challenge. When you suddenly have to invert the construction activities alignment with gravity. Okay, you can program that into your robot. You can put a simple if-then routine and say, if sealing isn't possible as a foundation, then you have to invert it. But the point is, you'd have to tell your robot that, or the alternatives, you have to give it the plan, the outcome, but that would be a kind of planning ability. Now, all right, Hubert and his team said, what happens if we make it a little harder for the bees? So they then inserted a glass ceiling and a glass floor. And what bees in that case did is that they neither used the ceiling or the floor. They attached the comb foundations to one of the side walls and built the two-dimensional sheet laterally through the cavity until they reached the opposite wall. So there's another degree of freedom there. If you can't build top down or bottom up, they just built sideways. This took the bees the longest, but they still did it. Now, the most remarkable thing, though, is what happened when, after this construction had been initiated. So bees started on one of the side walls, built the normally two-dimensional sheet through the cavity, and the authors then inserted a glass screen on the target wall. Okay, so this is what's shown in B here. So in panel B, the bees had begun to build in the direction of this wall here, and then found themselves with a challenge that wasn't there at the start. Suddenly, the target wall was made slippery. And what you might have expected is that the bees just continue building until they reach that wall. Then they realize, well, this is no good. Let's build some extra fortifications here, some vertical columns to attach to the floor or the ceiling, and so on. This is not what happened. What happened instead was that the bees, days before they reached that outcome, turned their wall 90 degrees and their comb 90 degrees and attached it to the nearest wood wall. So that's this curve here. And so Hubert at the time explained that I acknowledged that I could not suppress sentiment of admiration for an action in which the brightest foresight was displayed. So he thought bees couldn't have solved this problem any other way than basically extrapolating what would have happened had they continued building their comb in the same direction, and then took corrective action before that suboptimal outcome was reached. Now, these are 2-century-old experiments. They are visionary to my mind in terms of probing the flexibility of the behavior of an insect. Hubert was quite vocal in saying it's not just instinct, clearly, and so on. These experiments await replication. I'm still trying to nudge Vince to do some of them again with higher sample sizes and so on. I think he tried once with a similar outcome and then multiple more, and that didn't work quite so well. But we need more patience and so on. But I think the approach 200 years ago with probing the limits of an animal's flexibility in what was considered and is still considered largely instinctual behavior is quite impressive. Now, much of our work on bees learning and memory today is in the context of flower visitation. And the first thing in that context that is important is that, of course, bees see the world entirely differently from the way we do. Bees can see ultraviolet light, we cannot, and that means that bees often see flower patterns where we see none. So this is a bicolored flower for a bee, but not for a human. And that, of course, is a healthy reminder that the world we see is not the physical or the real world. It's one aspect, or it's a set of aspects that we perceive through the specific filters that we have acquired during evolution. Other animals have very different filters and see different aspects of reality. Now, the other thing that's important here is that bees as flower visitors need to be careful shoppers in the flower supermarket, to the extent that they're not narrow specialists that just focus their activity on one flower species. They need to compare the offerings of different plant species, the quantity and quality of nectar and pollen contained in them, and learn the advertising that comes with these rewards in the same way as we do when we're comparing products in a shop. So you or I might have your favorite brand of toothpaste, let's say, where you've come to associate the product with good quality and a reasonable price. And then you don't memorize the appearance of the toothpaste because that's just white. And you don't want to test it every time. You memorize the packaging, you memorize the signals that advertise the product for you, and then return to the same advertisement. And in the same way, bees memorize these color patterns, the scents, and also, of course, the locations of the flowers. And we, in a sense, exploit the bees' readiness to associate almost anything with these rewards. So what you can see here is an experiment where we've trained honeybees to land on this little platform and collect a droplet of sugar water. And you do that a few times. And then, and of course, this platform is in front of an image of a human face. And we do that a few times and then give the bees the equivalent of a crime witness test, where we then present her with more than one face, one of which was the one that they had previously been rewarded on. So you can see a few of these pairwise comparisons here, and we shuffle the spatial arrangement of the faces, and the rewards are no longer there, of course, in the testing situation. And you can see that with several of these pairs of faces, even though they are quite similar, actually, in some cases, the bee's performance at finding the correct face is above 80 or around 80%. That doesn't mean that the bee recognizes what we're presenting here as a face. For a bee, and to my mind, this is a strange flower, right? It's just a pattern that they can associate with reward. It just goes to show how much flexibility there is, and you'll see more of that. But that's the basic setup for many of our experiments. At the end of it, if the bee gets something right, she gets a bit of sugar water, just like in nature when she found the right flower. Now, one of the things that are challenging for bees is spatial orientation. And I've put this picture here because that might be a city, Shanghai, that some of you haven't yet visited. So you might all at some point or another have faced the challenge of navigating around an environment which you didn't already know. Maybe your phone was out of charge and you didn't have a map, so you actually had to memorize landmarks to find your way. And everyone who's tried this, even in these urban environments, knows that this can be tricky, especially if you can't read the signs or talk to passers-by in the street because of language barriers. If you just have to navigate using memory, there's a fair chance of getting lost. However, of course, these kinds of environments are relatively easy to any natural environment because all these landmarks are built to be memorable. They're built to be unique and to stand out. The architects take pride in building something that is different from the other landmarks. And that, of course, facilitates navigation. Now, natural landmarks that you have to navigate as a bee, for example, or any animal that needs to find its home, and that's not just in the case of bees, honeybees, but all bees, all the ones that have a nest, and that includes the many thousands of solitary bee species that people are often less aware of. But in addition to the familiar honeybees and bumblebees, there are, of course, thousands of bees who are all single mothers, and they have a nest to which they must return without fail. If they fail, if they don't find their nest, then in the case of solitary bees, their offspring's dead. In the case of social bees, they themselves might be dead. So this is a landscape in central Mexico, and I do quite a bit of hiking there. I can tell you this is challenging. There's no mobile phone reception. There are no paths. All you have is your memory. And there's lots of aliasing. There are thousands of trees that all look similar. There are thousands of hill shapes that all look similar. And if you're a bee, you can't, in foggy conditions, say, well, this looks a bit iffy to me, I'll stay at home today. They have to go out there and work, right? And it often gets more foggy than that. And so it is indeed not a trivial task, especially not if you have a very, very small brain. Wrong laptop. There we go. So this is the technology that we nowadays use to study bees navigation. It's a harmonic radar system where the bottom of these two dishes emits a signal that is picked up and transposed to different frequency with a so-called transponder, which bounces it back at a harmonic frequency, and that's then picked up by this top dish. The dream with this device, as Vince knows, was so we can pick up very robustly two-dimensional coordinates. What we're working towards now with collaborators in France is the third dimension, the height, in addition to the XY coordinates. Wrong laptop again. And what we hope to do is to not just extract the bee's X, Y, Z coordinates. This is a simulation of a honeybee drone's orientation flight, again generated by Vince. So the idea is that if we know where the bee is in flight, including all three dimensions, then we can reconstruct what the bee sees while she's flying. We can take the view from the cockpit of the bee and see which kinds of landmarks are actually of interest. So these two boomerang shapes are a bee's eyes, and you can see that the picture she sees is very coarse-grained because visual spatial resolution is lower, much lower than in the human eye, although bees can to some extent compensate for that by rapid scanning movements, and they process information faster than humans can. Now, here's one of the many challenges that we are setting the bees in spatial orientation. It's the traveling salesman problem. And I guess the name is more or less self-explanatory. The challenge is this: if you're a salesman, let's say, working supply Waterstones with books or something, and you want in the course of a day to visit 5 cities to sell them a product, then of course you want to find a route that minimizes travel distance and expenditure. And that's a common problem for bees as well, because they can typically not fill up at just one flower, but they have to visit multiple feeding stations, multiple patches often to fill up their tummies once. And so we've set up this challenge here, in this case, this is Joe Woodgate et al.'s work, with 5 feeding stations and the nest down here. And you can see one flight route in this image and several other ones. Green is early, orange is the middle, red is late in the track. And you can see this is clearly not yet optimal. But of course, the bee is not given a map to start with. She has to find these locations first before then optimizing a route. And what we can do is monitor a bee's progress over multiple flights. And this is what you're seeing here, sped up multiple times. So this bee has now found the first 2 locations, and now the second 2, and now the 5th one. We're in the 6th, 7th flight now, so the bout counter is in the top left corner. And you can see that the bee's track gets increasingly more streamlined until there's less and less exploration outside the area. And in the end, she actually basically zeroes in on the best solution and then just goes through this loop continuously and repeatedly. So they're very good at solving these multi-destination challenges. But another thing that we were interested in with Joe Woodgate, so this is bumblebees, by the way, Bombus terrestris. So this is a different kind of observation. In this case, we're not actually setting the bees any challenges. We're leaving her to her own devices. We just focus on one individual bee for as long as she lives, from her maiden flight, the first time she ever leaves the native nest, to her death, basically. And what you're seeing here is the bee's very first flight, sped up 130 times. The nest is here. You can see the bee loops in different directions. Sorry, this is a bit jumpy, but always returning to the vicinity of her nest without entering it, and then flying out in a different direction and exploring further. You can see she never flies twice in the same direction, so she explores in various directions, but she covers quite a bit of territory in this very first flight. Also of importance is that during this first flight, she visits this forest edge up here. That will be of interest a few slides down the line. So that's this particular bee's wandering and searching phase. And on the next day, she did one more exploratory loop in a southwesterly direction here in green. Green again is early, orange in the middle, red late. And now she's discovered something. She's now discovered a patch by this forest edge where she hadn't visited before, that she clearly liked. She ceased her exploring completely and switched to being a patch exploiter. And in that phase, now for several days, that bee just flew to only one patch and did nothing but that, like an assembly line worker. I should say every bee is different. So here we have a focus of one individual bee for its entire life. Other bees at the extreme other end never cease exploring. They just keep looking for even better things, and some other bees are more in the middle. And so then there were, after these so these are several dozen sequential flights of the same individual. Then there were a few days of rainy weather and the bee stayed inside. And then after that, on day 11, when she came out again, she spent a few more flights in this patch that she had already been exploiting for the first week of her life. And then suddenly appeared to change her mind and flew to another patch, or might have for most for the online audience, that she had only visited once before at the very start of her life, 10 days earlier. And she did so without actually retracing her steps back to the hive, apparently retrieving that distant memory of a patch that she had only visited during her first flight ever. So a very distant memory was trolled up there from way back then. And so if I sort of discussed this sort of work with experts with who work with primates and corvid birds, classic icons of animal intelligence, they would always say, yeah, but that's all just associative learning, and bees are just good at learning spatial coordinates or colors, flower colors, because that's what a bee does. They're pre-programmed to learn these things. And of course, that annoyed me quite early on, because I did believe that they're quite smart, than bees. And so we did then various experiments to actually probe the limits of bee intelligence with tasks that they do not face on a daily basis. And here's one, an experiment where way back when, with my friend Carl Geiger, we explored the question of whether bees are sensitive to the number of landmarks. And what we did here is we had a hive over here. The bees had to flow past 3 tents before finding a feeding station. And once the bees had learned this, we then produced various contradictions between the learned distance and the number of landmarks. And we did this by, for example, over the same distance where there were previously 3 landmarks, we put 4 or 5 or 2. And it turned out that the more landmarks we inserted, the earlier the bees as a group would land. If we reduced the number of landmarks, the bees would tend to overshoot the target until they ticked off 3. So they were clearly sensitive to the number of landmarks. This was the first time that any of my work got into the press. And this is I don't know if there are any Americans here. Dave Barry is a famous comedian, writer who then wrote for the Washington Post journal. And so he said this, the article states that these scientists whose names are Lars and Carl set up various landmarks between a beehive and a feeder, and so on. The surprising result, Lars and Carl were both killed by eyeball stings. No, seriously, they discovered that the bees were locating the feeder by counting the landmarks. Yes, bees can count. This means that bees, in terms of math skills, are ahead of most American high school graduates. Anyway, so there was a first demonstration that we could confront bees with a challenge that they do not encounter on a daily basis in their environments. And here's some more. So this is actually a video that was filmed in our lab.
We've recently discovered something even more surprising about insects. It turns out that some are really, really smart. One test of intelligence in animals is when they're given a problem, they can work out a solution in their heads. Bring a piece of food from a perch out of reach, and a smart bird like a raven soon works out what to do. Just pull the string, hold it with your foot, pull a bit more, and in no time at all, you have a snack. Yet anything a mere vertebrate can do, bumblebees can also do this, even though they must be trained to solve the problem. Pull a string and reach a reward of nectar. Now, this bee hasn't been trained at all. But if she's allowed to watch her nestmate solving the problem, she knows exactly what to do when she gets her turn. teachers and students, and all with brains only the size of pinheads. Combine this with the flexibility of the basic insect layout, and there's not much that insects can't do.
Yeah, so what you can do with these intelligence tests and the combination with social learning is this kind of setup where, in this case, we've paired two bees, one experienced marked with a red dot, one inexperienced. And you do that a few times, and the inexperienced bee will then be able to perform the technique by herself. And then what you can do is, in the same way as people evaluate how memes spread through human social media networks, we can ask who invented it, who copies it first, how quickly does it spread? And this sort of analysis is done here, where this was work by Sylvain Lem and our team. We arranged all the bees of one bumblebee colony in a circle. Each individual, each bee is one dot. And the innovator, the bee who managed it first, is at the top. That's our yellow 31 here. And once a line forms between two individuals, that's when the target individual has also, no, sorry, this is when there's an interaction of the kind that we've seen. Once the dot turns colored, that means the target individual can now do it by herself. And you can now see there's a good bunch of orange bees. These are all individuals that have learned the technique from yellow 31 at the top. But by now, there are also some purple bees here. And these are now essentially third generation learners. They're a set of learners that have no longer picked up the technique from yellow 31, but from the orange bees. So there's several sequential sets of bees all learning the technique from the respective previous generation. And in fact, in some cases, the technique continues to spread through the colony even after the original innovator has died. So they only live a few weeks. That's natural to happen in the course of such an experiment. But you then have a colony-specific learned technique that's spread via social learning that only this group of bees has. No other bee colony in the world can do this, right? So it's really like a cultural difference where you have different monkeys, primates, fishing termites in different ways. Skip these things. So for the next experiment, I'll let Jane Goodall do the introduction.
The most recent example which blows people's minds is the bumblebee. And
she's not actually trembling. This is
rolls it backwards, rolls the little ball until he can push it down, or maybe she, I don't know, into a hole, like a goal. And as soon as this ball gets into the goal, the bumblebee is given a little drop of nectar as a reward. So they learn to do this. But the mind-blowing thing is other bumblebees who've merely watched a taught bumblebee can do the same without being taught, just by watching. And that is supposed to be a mark of very superior intelligence. So this is something we're learning all the time. We have been far too arrogant. The animal kingdom of which we are a part is filled with secrets. And gosh, I'd love to be young and learning about these things now, because all the doors are wide open and you never know what you're going to find.
She just turned 90, by the way, so happy birthday. So for me, this was a big deal because Jane Goodall was sort of one of my heroines when I was young and started working in behavioral biology. And for her to recognize our work, normally primate people are very arrogant with regards to, well, intelligence of any other animal, but for her to notice our work and indeed say, hey, I'd like to be young now and study bees was quite moving. So let me fill this with a bit more detail. So the task indeed is to We need to get these videos to work, and that might be challenging. I don't know if I can work it from this machine. I might need some help here, because I don't actually have the display here to start the video. Well, let's not maybe waste too much time.
Is this one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, good. Thank you so much. All right, so the task is indeed to get the ball into the goal area. And the bee manages this just fine. But the social learning task here is a little different. And so you can see 3 balls. And obviously the best way to solve this puzzle is to pick the closest ball and move that to the center, because that obviously is the most energy saving mode. But this bee, the one that we've taught the task, knows that that doesn't work, because we've actually glued down the 2 closest balls. And this bee knows this one can't be moved, that one can't be moved. I can only move this one. And so that's what she does. So she moves that ball to the center, and then they both get a big dollop of sugar water. And we do that a few times. The question then is, what does this naive observer do when put on the spot? So she's never rolled the ball for reward before. We then ask that observer, now you've seen this 3 times. How do you solve the task? Do you just ape the demonstrator? Do you just copy what you've seen? Or do you get what the ultimately desired outcome of the task is? So here's our bee all alone. She hasn't done anything with balls except watch the other bee roll it. And we're then asking, how do you solve the task? And she picks the closest ball, or the second closest sometimes, but never the furthest away. So she does not simply copy the actions of the demonstrator, but instead solves the task in a new way that hasn't been demonstrated to her, in a better way, by picking the closest ball. And this to us indicates that there's some sort of understanding of the desirable end state of these actions, rather than simply mimicking what you've just seen someone else do, right? Here's another. Vince figures prominently in today's presentation. Simulation by Vince of a bee scanning over a number of flowers through her, and we get the bee eye view through these boomerang shapes here. It seems obvious, perhaps, that bees must be good at recognizing shapes, because they find the right flowers all the time. But it turns out that quite a bit of this shape recognition can actually be done with relatively simple feature detectors, edge detectors, motion detectors, simple neurons that extract some bits of information without integrating the whole thing. Like your phone, for example, can recognize your face, but it can't imagine a face. It doesn't have an integrated representation of your face. And so the question then is, how can we find out if a bee actually can imagine a thing like a flower? And so what we've done here is we've done a so-called cross-modal recognition experiment. This is Quinn Solby's work, mostly, of our team. And so she was interested in exploring whether bees can picture things by finding shapes in multiple sensory modalities. And so this is an experiment where the bees were first, bumblebees again, trained to recognize a particular shape, in this case, through vision alone, okay? So she has to learn to distinguish balls from cubes, but she can only see them, she can't touch them. She sees them through a plexiglass lid, and that bee has learned to to find a reward on spheres or balls. And we then ask, can the same bee recognize these shapes by touch alone in complete darkness under infrared light? And in essence, that is similar to the older generation might remember a birthday party kiddie game where you'd reach into a bag where you couldn't see and you'd have to retrieve an object, like a key or a spoon or a screwdriver, without seeing it. You'd previously seen it outside, but you can't actually see it while it's in that bag. You have to sort of fumble for it and find the right shape. And if you can do that, that indicates that because you can't do it with using the same sensory input that you have had during training, you have to somehow picture the thing. What properties does it have? And this is what we did here. And indeed, bees trained on balls were able to find the balls in complete darkness when they couldn't see them under infrared light, and vice versa if we trained them in darkness. So this bee has been trained to get her so the bee has been trained on cubes, and subsequently, if we then present her with options of cubes and balls in lit conditions, which she hadn't experienced these shapes with before, you can see here. So she's first trying to feed here. There's no reward in this, no scent cues. So she inspects the balls, looks at them, says, no, that's not what I want, and then lands on the cube again. So trained in the dark and then tested in light, that transfer also works. Now, given that we've done all this work with bees and balls, perhaps it's unsurprising that someone eventually had to ask, do they actually like to play with balls? And this was Samadhi Galpayaga's PhD thesis. She asked, what happens if we give the bees balls without there being any reward in the vicinity? And so in this case, there is no sugar water, and all the other experiments you've seen were training experiments where the bees had to learn a correct or incorrect option. Here, there's no reward other than moving the balls about. And the bees had to basically go out of their way to come back to this chamber where we presented them with balls and often rolled them for extended periods. Perhaps unsurprisingly, younger bees did this more than older bees, in line with what you find with other animals playing. Perhaps equally unsurprisingly, male bees, bumblebees, did this a lot more than female bees. Male bumblebees, some of you know this already, but maybe not everyone, are perfectly useless for the colony. They don't do any work of any sort. In bumblebees, at least they can feed themselves, which in honeybees is not even, they have to be fed. But they have a lot more time on their hands, and perhaps in this case used it for rolling the balls around. That, I guess, brings us to the last and perhaps most difficult question. If the bees are enjoying activities, could they be said to have some sort of emotion-like states? And I would have probably 20 years ago dismissed this as either unanswerable on a good day, or perhaps just downright ridiculous on another. But there's one study with twins that changed my mind a little bit, where we were interested in the question of whether bees can learn about predation threat, whether they can learn to avoid flowers infested with these so-called crab spiders. These are sit-and-wait predators that are quite scary, and that they can actually lurk on flowers and take on the color of the flowers, so they're not very well visible. Bees often do get away, not always. Sometimes things go wrong, but they are, of course, strong flyers, bees, so there is opportunity for them to escape and to learn in some scenarios. And so here's see if I can start this video. Here's how this situation looks. So we've taken this situation into the laboratory. We've built these life-sized spider models combined with 2 sponge pads that could briefly capture, but not injure a bee, and then release it again. So here's a bee landing on a safe flower, and now she makes a mistake. She flies to a spider-infested flower. This sounds gruesome, but the pads were very soft, so nothing bad happened to me. But the astonishing thing was that the bees not only learned quite well to avoid the spider threats, they learned it better if the spiders were more easily visible and more poorly if they were cryptic, which you might expect. But their whole demeanor changed. So they would scan every flower before deciding whether to land, often for several seconds and even 24 hours after such an attack. But the most surprising thing for us were the many false alarms, where visits where the bees inspected what was a perfectly safe flower, no spider there, and then rejected it as if they'd seen a ghost. And this looked to us really so that they conjured up the threat simply from the memory of the event, not from any present stimulus, even 24 hours after an attack like that. And that, at least superficially speaking, did look a bit like a post-traumatic stress disorder, even though, of course, we can't talk to the bee to ask it, but it looked a bit like that. So we've meanwhile also done further investigations on optimism and pessimism, like states and pain experiences. So there seems to be at least increasing evidence that there are some sort of emotion-like states. Very briefly, a small introduction into the beauty of an insect brain. So here's a frontal view of a bee brain. They are small, of course. And from the relatively limited number of neurons, so there are about 1 million nerve cells in a bumblebee, slightly fewer in a honeybee, you might conclude that that's a relatively simple brain until you take a closer look inside. So everything's small, but very elegantly miniaturized. Just these so-called optic ganglia, shaded here in light blue, lamina, medulla, and lobula, which process visual information, have more different types of neurons than the human retina. We have about 80, the bee has about 120. So the computational processes are staggeringly complex. And so here's a single nerve cell, 1 of 1 million neurons of a bee brain. Okay, this nerve cell was discovered by Martin Hammer in Randolph Menzel's lab. It's basically the reward pathway. Thank you, Vince. That tells a bee's brain, I've just eaten something sweet. Just that single nerve cell has a structure as differentiated, as finely branched as a fully grown oak tree. Okay, now imagine you have 1 million of them. All wired together in a way that in some cases allows 10,000 connections between one such cell and lots of others. And all of these synaptic connections are at least technically, theoretically plastic and subject to learning and memory and modification by experience. And this staggering complexity of insect brains was recognized quite early on. Several of the founding fathers of today's neuroscience over a century ago were impressed by the exploration of insect brains. Here's what Ramon y Cajal said. He said, the excellence of the psychic machine does not increase with zoological hierarchy. Instead, one realizes that in fish and amphibians, the nervous centers have undergone an unexpected simplification. Of course, the gray matter has increased considerably in mass, but when the structure of their brains is compared with that of bees or dragonflies, they're excessively plain, coarse, and rudimentary. It is as if one were to pretend to hold as equals the merits of a rough grandfather clock with the quality of a fine pocket watch, a marvel of fineness, delicacy, and precision. As always, in building her marvelous works, nature distinguishes herself much more in her tiny creations than in the large. This is 1915. So just a few take-home messages. So I think there is now convincing evidence that bees have mental representations of the space around them, of things in that space, and can flexibly use it, that they can, at least in the case of the species we study, use objects in a way that quite simple, at least tool use, including an awareness of the outcomes of their own actions, a goal-directedness. And it appears, at least by using the same criteria that are used for domestic animals and pets and so on, emotion-like states. And I think these are key ingredients of a mind. And I think this, for me, means that we humans are thinking and feeling and enjoying and suffering beings in a world of other thinking, feeling, enjoying and suffering beings. However different their psychology might be, their priorities in life, but it inspires a kind of respect for the natural world that goes beyond just saying bees are useful for us because they do all of this pollinating of crops and garden flowers. They deserve our respect, to my mind, because of their intelligence and their likely sentience. So I'll stop there. I've brought a few copies of my book if anyone would like a signed copy, but I'll shut up now and let Johanna take over.
Oh, no. Thanks, Lars. That's wonderful. I'm obviously a fan. I've got a hard copy pre-order, so I knew it was coming. Lars has signed it. It's well thumbed. I obviously in the law school, it might seem strange that I might be wanting to talk about bees. But what I want to talk a little bit about what struck me also about the mind of the bee, but and perhaps I should open with that. But what I'm quite interested in is what this insight from cognitive ethology actually helps us to think about intellectual property, creativity, authorship, what matters to people in that context. Really interesting in the mind of the bee, the opening discussion talks about the kind of perils of a collective and the way that the bees are thought about as mindless cogs in a machine, and the individuality of each bee is kind of masked by all the presumptions that are made because they appear to be moving en masse. And it's really interesting because there's a particular appreciation in I'm sure everyone here has probably already read The Mind of a Bee, but the appreciation for the individuality within, for example, the swarm, and the idea that this isn't just one throbbing living being, but actually there are individual decisions happening within the swarm. And that actually is very relevant for how we think about other animals such as humans and their relationship to creativity, their goals, their wants. Because the same kinds of charges and generalizations are made about consumers, are made about fans, are made about authors as well. And so we have this often arbitrary language around incentives and what people want from authorship, which is really a policy discussion, but has nothing to do with why people are writing or why people are making things. And this idea of the bees, this is quoting Lars, the way they're approached as indistinguishable, interchangeable, mass-produced entities. There's a very same issue in intellectual property discourse around users and around different forms of art, including things like fashion, for example. And so when Lars asked what it's like to be a bee, in the refrain on Thomas Nagel's famous essay, there is something that it is like to be a bee, but in my own work, I've been asking the same kind of question, but in a way, what is it like to make like a bee? So what is it like for a bee to create, to actually make something? And there was something you were saying as you were speaking, Lars, about when you were comparing the termite hill, that we look at this as one is just this preordained, pre-programmed construction, and the other has this figure of an author, and whether or not that person is then commanding a room of technicians or engineers and so forth. And that's really interesting because that has an impact also in IP, how we simplify authorship in IP. So how we simplify, for example, who makes a film. We always talk about the director making a film, and the director is the author and the figure of the film. But in fact, there's all of this other work that goes on in a collaborative piece of work like film. So I've been trying to think about that, and it gives a lot of insight into creativity and the current debates in IP around non-human authorship. But of course, it's fascinating to me that those debates are all fixated upon artificial intelligence. And yet, why are we not talking about animals? If we're willing to countenance that a machine might be an author, why not a bee? You know, that there's the reason is largely because these narratives around authorship are actually being shoehorned into what resolves policy discussions, and so what resolves where the economics of creativity. And this so for me, an ecological approach to property is something that starts to enliven property, because it starts to make us think about our relations through objects and through the path building of property. So I've started this inquiry in a book that I wrote a couple of years ago called Owned, which is where I developed this idea of an ecological jurisprudence of property. What does it mean to actually start to question how we resolve as humans property issues, but approaching it through an ecological lens? So, for example, looking at shared spaces. So where different species share the same space, and you'll have these mobile overlapping territories, but there will be an idea of property, but it's not property in the sense of borders, but actually these kind of porous contact points. And that is a lot of that makes so much sense when you start to approach it through an ecological lens, but it's also something that's in really early property jurisprudence. But it's not something that has made it through to contemporary discourse around property, particularly when it's engaged in sort of advocacy discussions. So these kind of shared interests and a kind of relational property. So how does this relate then to the more specific question of intangible property or intellectual property? So a lot of what I've thought about in Owned was the role of scent, and also in resolving human wildlife conflict, the role of scent. So actually shifting boundaries just through smells. So animals, different species can continue to use the same space, but it might be configured in a slightly different way. So the path building as well of scent trails. So really early sociology talks about the fact that, and this is in mobilities research as well, oh, but humans build bridges, humans build roads, but of course, so do insects. You know, the bees, in the mind of a bee, we look at the way that building certain trails, but also when you think about ants and so forth, and even if you look at the results of the incredible highways to anthills and so forth, I mean, that these are amazing cities. So smell landmarks and so on. Why this is then relevant for intellectual property is because it really struggles with understanding different types of works. So looking at a visual work or a work that can somehow take up a space. But then when you have things like scent art, smell art, and sound art, it always has to be turned into a visual work in order for it to enjoy any kind of protection. And this becomes really interesting in art history, but it also becomes really interesting when we look at traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. So the knowledge of indigenous and local peoples is usually completely unthinkable within IP paradigms, because it is something that isn't often the same kind of author. Indigenous and local communities are often homogenized and essentialized as, oh, it's all communal, and if you protect it, it's actually contrary to principles of open knowledge, so it's a conflict of freedom of expression. All of these things are similar kinds of turning people into an indistinguishable mass. So why I am very interested in ethology then is that these non-human animal property models, and there is a real idea of property, and something actually that I don't know if my notes are always a complete mess, but something you said, Lars, made me think of this as well, how the bees actually appreciate a kind of property. But this how challenges like traditional knowledge are talked about in IP is it's defensive. It's so it's to protect it. You don't want to threaten freedom of expression. So, but some of the approaches are defensive. So like a defensive patent or disclosure or something like that. And this is a kind of persistent colonialism in IP, in traditional knowledge discourse. And I actually think that ecological approaches really start to say, we have to think about this diversity of perspectives in human creativity as well, and look at these different forms of perception. And so, but interestingly, all of that in IP is given a biological imperative, a scientific imperative. This is how it works. You know, it's always this recourse to things like competition and survival of the fittest and things like this, which of course is completely poor science at best. To argue that way, it doesn't take account of the reciprocal altruism and cooperation as something that has a tremendous adaptive value. All of that is masked in IP and the economics, the language that is attached to it. So that's why I think an ecological approach is really important for complicating in a really useful way the oversimplified discourse around property and people and things. And that's what also characterizes animal studies discussions. So for me, the expressiveness of bees is what really is something that I'm particularly focused on. And the idea, like in the discussion around the development of color and the development of color in flowers and the development of color perception, the role of the bees, like in almost in motivating the flowers towards a particular direction, like that there's an adaptive quality to that aesthetic sense in a way, and that kind of ingenuity is something that is really, really fascinating. And also, as you say, talking about the bee as a consumer, again, this is something that really provides so much insight into how we think about intellectual property as a commercial property, branding, and trademarks, and so forth. The way that this idea of the product, actually the packaging being so creative, such a big part of that, is very relevant. And so we saw lots of really wonderful examples of where bees were exercising freedom and choice in what they were doing. And that is a fundamental principle of authorship, that and of what can be protected in IP, that you are able to choose. If for any reason you're constrained in some way for doing something in a particular way, in the most simplest generalization, that's not something you can get protection for. So how the law understands creativity and authorship is fundamentally through this principle of choice, this freedom, and seeing this is what is underpinning a lot of these examples is so important here. And of course, with the object play, I find that really interesting, because also the object is the kind of communication through objects is something that's very relevant to intellectual property. So ultimately, for me, so I also teach and write in animal welfare law and animal studies. And one of the things that I think is actually very critical here is creativity as having an important value in the welfare discussion. So in the same way that we talk about creativity for humans, start to think about IP as also having there's a welfare dimension of IP for authors, for performers, but also putting creativity into the discussion around the welfare of individual animals. And ultimately, the Mind of a Bee concludes with the really important discussion of conservation and the disparity between the attention to charismatic species like tigers and lions and so forth, and this willful disregard of the insect apocalypse, and of course the manicured lawns. The only thing I hate more than manicured lawns. So I just love that bit because I become incensed, I become enraged and antisocial about manicured lawns. The thing I hate more is plastic lawns. Like the fact that people, well, I want a manicured lawn, I'm not going to mow, I'm going to put this burning hot plastic in my backyard. What a great idea. Really, really dreadful. But what is really interesting here from a welfare perspective is to start to think about the co-production. So looking at creativity, the co-production between humans and non-human animals. And in the comb construction, so I was reading something just recently about different examples of co-production in art between humans and non-human animals. Now, the use of animals in art is quite controversial, but these were examples where there had been some kind of seemingly consensual, if I can put it that way, collaboration rather than some of the other more exploitative uses. And they said, one of the examples they provided was comb construction, and they said, oh, but of course this is just instinctual, but isn't it great? Doesn't it look like great architecture? But of course it's just instinctual. And I thought it's still persisting even in those areas where people are perhaps more inclined to understand and appreciate their creativity. It is still persisting in that context with insects, and that really bothers me. The book I'm finishing at the moment is looking at insects in this context. The creativity, the play is an important aspect of this. So I want to kind of push the question of the importance of creativity towards the urgent question of compassion and connected existences in this context. So I think we're ultimately limiting aesthetic experiences and creative lives and our idea of what is an aesthetic expression. So in one of my master's modules, that we look at different examples of animals being what might be considered creative, and some of the students are really, yes, this is creative, there's no reason this is different from what a person might be doing and something or other. And then other people might be approach it and go, I can't see how this is creative. The animal is just walking through space, they're going to do that anyway, or what have you. But when we start to really try to dislodge our assumptions, then they go, well, actually that's largely down to my perception of what might count as creative, what is presented to us as creative, what is framed in a museum or presented as of value. And so I think the more we can push towards this creativity question, I think is important. And there is some interaction there with environmentalism and restoration ethics, but I think what is really exciting about creativity is humans start to get excited and interested in the purposeful life of a bee. The bee wanting to express something over and above what the usual story around this is for survival, this is just instinct. And that's why I particularly love the Mind of a Bee. So thank you, Lars. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. Thank you all for fascinating presentations. I realize that it's a little bit late, so let's just open the floor for questions and discussion.
Should I sit
Yes,
over
please,
there?
please.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions?
Do you want to mastermind the discussion, or?
Yes.
I think you were first anyway.
So with the face experiment, How do they know it was, how do you know it was?
So that's a good question. Bees have a very keen sense of smell, and if we allow them to use it, they will. So let's say we did an experiment where, so they have smelly feet basically, and wherever they land, they leave a little bit of that smell. If we didn't clean that away, they would just return to the same location. Which spot smells most like my feet? So they're very good at that. And so we have to really watch out with all these experiments to remove the scent marks very carefully, because otherwise, yes, they would use just that. In addition, of course, we shuffle the spatial positions. Watching out for possible scent cues is very important.
Sorry, someone from the audience is asking to repeat the question because they cannot hear. So could you, before answering the question?
Sure. So the question just now was, what about smell? Can't bees solve some of these tasks using their sense of smell? And the answer to that is yes, they can. And with all the training experiments that we do, we really have to make sure to rule out that they can use, for example, their own scent to find their way back to a location, a particular pattern where we've previously offered them a reward and so on.
What are the next big questions in determining the components that might make up the mind of the bee?
Well, I mean, I think that there are many, and one of the things that are the hardest to answer are indeed the question of a sentience. So we can do all of these intelligence tests in a fairly clear-cut way. If the question is, can a bee count? Or can it form a concept of above or below? And so on, or recognize an image of a face. That's relatively easy in terms of an experimental approach. So long as you've done the experiments right and you've done all your controls and you've ruled out scent cues and so on, you can really find relatively simple yes, no answers for such questions. Asking the question of, does this animal feel something? And if so, what does it feel in this or that situation is harder. Not necessarily harder for bees than it is for domestic dogs or robots or AI systems, but you can see the debate right there. When do you diagnose a state of emotions in an artificial intelligence system? There's no single universally accepted test that one can use. So all we can do is use probabilities and say, okay, now adding up the evidence we have from experiments 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from so many different labs, this looks increasingly likely or less, as the case may be. But this is a hard question, but it's obviously a very important one, because beyond the mere intellectually motivated or curiosity motivated question of how much intelligence can you squeeze into how small a brain, which is part of what we find fascinating. The question of whether an animal is sentient has very obvious welfare implications for how we deal with these animals in nature, how we deal with beekeeping practices, and extrapolating from bees to other insects, how we deal with the 1 trillion or so farmed insects that are generated in the insect feed and food industry, and so on. So there are very important applied welfare implications from this sort of work. So these are important questions, however difficult they may be. On the front of bee intelligence, insect intelligence, I guess one of the questions that I hadn't addressed here, so I've only reported positive results. What the flip side of that is, what can they not do? And that's also something that I really like to explore. How can we link the admittedly small size of their nervous system, the particular wiring diagrams that they have, to limits of cognition. What can they not do?
In your experiments, when you were using the big spiders and the other you said that some of the bees exhibited what looked like post-traumatic stress and we verify it. Did you get any bees that didn't observe that because they become trap happy? Because we see that a lot when we're doing studies on birds, and barking at birds, so especially at feed stations, and repeatedly flying to the net, get handled, and keeping them back to the studio. Do you have any of that kind of experiences with the bees where they're trap happy?
No, not really. I mean,
Repeat the question again.
apologies. Yeah, so the question was in the experiment with the crab spiders and the bees. So the question, can bees learn about predation threat? And we found that the bees displayed what seemed like a sort of long-term anxiety-like state. The question was, do we sometimes find the opposite, that with repeated exposure to such simulated predation attacks, might there be some bees that responded with increasing levels of aggression, for example? And we didn't find that in this case. I guess it also depends a little bit on context. So I think bees in general tend to be more aggressive if they're disturbed at or near the nest. And so it might be that in such a setting, there might be increasing levels of aggression with a repeated similar threat. In the case of bumblebees, because they don't have barbed stings, they can also sting multiple times. So you could deploy your aggressive levels multiple times sequentially to repeat attacks.
Yes.
Relating again to the crab spider experiment, I kind of got two questions. Do you think you could then further study, you said the kind of movement and behavior change, do you think you could use motion tracking software to see how that changed and pinpoint the differences with that?
Yeah, so this is a 15-year-old study. What we did do was we did three-dimensional flight tracking in an automated way at the time, but of course the technologies that are available nowadays with deep lab cut and sleep and so on, basically AI-powered software to analyze and quantitatively not just overall body movements, but the movements of individual limbs and so on. There are much more powerful tools to see how a behavioral repertoire might change as a result of such interventions. In vertebrate animal welfare, it's quite common now in farm animals and so on to use such tools to examine body posture as an indicator of emotion-like states. So that's a wide area on the map that we could explore using such tools, of course. Again, sorry, I apologize, I didn't repeat the question. So the question was, can we use automated tracking tools to evaluate behavior, for example, in response to these simulated predation attacks? And the answer is yes, there are now quite wonderful tools that weren't around just a few years ago to quantify behavior and the grammar of behavior, the syntax, in fully automated and artificial intelligence powered ways.
Yeah. Is that follow-up?
Yeah. Sorry. Related to that crab size again, the bee that presented PTSD-like behavior, do you think if you had other bees observing this behavior, do you think they would learn from that behavior that they shouldn't be in those flowers?
Yeah, so the question is there social learning also of threat or risk? So we had some of the work on socially learning string pulling and so on I had shown. Is there also social learning of predation threat? And the answer is yes. So they can also learn from observing such attacks to subsequently avoid spider infested flowers, and even generalize to other flowers of the same species, so to speak.
I isn't really about bees, it's more about intellectual property. Now, can I do that? Okay, right. Something which is quite common in the animal world, territoriality.
Yeah.
And how that relates to intellectual property. Effectively, if you're big territorial, you're saying to your competitors, well, we've got a resource here. You may know it's here. You can't use that knowledge. I can see it in hornets, where if you put out feeding stations for hornets, and you go along and you try and take the feeding stations away, before you get upstairs, they sort of try to enforce their intellectual property rights. If they know where it is, it's theirs. You can't have it.
Yeah.
Comment on that?
Yeah, so a lot of the territoriality, behavior around territoriality is relevant to understanding a kind of a property relation within four different species. So a lot of it is relevant then to, I mean, yes, that's basically guarding resources. I'll move on to IP in a second, it's slightly different, but yeah, so that's a basic kind of property relation. The other thing that I've remembered, which Lars was saying, was also about how understanding how to get back home is much more this kind of higher intelligence is largely seen in species with homes. So again, that relates to this property discussion. So property is underpinning what we understand as social behavior, a kind of civilizing of the human species, when they stopped wandering around and they started to stand still. And so this sociality is largely relating to a place. So territoriality is of course also relating to a place, whether it's around the nest or whether it's around resources that you have a cache of resources around the nest, or it might be the particular patch. So that the patch, not necessarily with the bees, but other species, there might be something like that. With IP, it's interesting because the whole notion of intellectual property, first of all, it's intangible. So it's not a resource as such. It's converted into a kind of resource in order that you can control what happens to it, so that you can regulate how it moves. So Lars, making it into a book. So I buy the book, I don't own the copyright in the book, but I can manage then how it passes between people. Lars still has the resource of the copyright. Now, the idea is that you regulate how those exchanges occur. So I bought the book, so now all the rights in terms of that, I can give it to you or I can sell it or what have you. So IP regulates it in that way, but the idea is that there is access. So what underpins intellectual property is a basic principle of access. Whether or not it actually works out that way is a different question. So so we have this intangible property that's converted into a kind of physical resource, but the relationship to that resource is slightly different. But you are quite right. Your instinct, if you like, if I can put it that way, or your intuition about those kind of territorial discussions is exactly the kind of discourse that then is deployed in IP debates or in IP policy discussions. It's stuff around theft, it's stuff around stealing, it's mine, etc., etc. And so that is where we run into some problems, I think. And that is why understanding a bit more intelligently, if you like, how we engage with those resources or how those relations are regulated, rather than focusing on the object. And that becomes really meaningful then if we start to look at all the things that are happening at the moment in IP industries, such as fashion. So fashion is the second most polluting industry on the planet. And it's of course completely about replacing and trends. You've got to buy another new thing, it's got to be another object, people buy, selling things. So fashion is an IP industry that is trying to address that kind of question and the sustainability question by selling less, which doesn't seem to make sense. But actually, if you start to look then at the sort of mobilities in property around through the ecological lens, there's all these other ways that you generate value in that context. So it takes it out of that really kind of oversimplified. I've called it, because there's something in dog training language they've called it predatory drift. And I call it, and the idea is that if a dog is playing and it looks like play fighting, it might turn into a real fight. And of course, what you were saying about play is so important because it's actually functionally different and distinct. And if we look at all of the cliche around animal play is that, oh, it's practicing to do something, it's practicing to hunt, it's got a purpose other than just being about play. And that's the other thing I really love about your research, is it points. I mean, I know there's a lot of work going on in play, but pointing this out in bees, I think, is just fantastic, because it shows this expressive surplus of interest in bees that's beyond what you might own, what you might need to do to survive, etc., etc. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Go back to Lars. If you put out a hefty food source deal from these, and so you've got a lot of them aggregating would you then, if other bumblebees or other insect after these sorts came along, would the bees demonstrate any sort of sense of proprietary rights over the thing that they found they can use?
So in the temperate habitats that I've seen, that's very rare. I've seen relatively rarely seen direct aggression, for example, of bees at flowers. You do see it a lot at nest entrances. Honeybees try to raid each other's homes. They try to get into bumblebee nests. Bumblebees go into honeybee nests. Wasps try to steal honey and so on. And there is, of course, also vicious defense against such invasions. At flowers, less so. I think in all my life, I've seen one time where one bumblebee killed another on a flower, but I've looked at lots of bumblebees on flowers in my life. So I think it's relatively rare here. In the tropics, there's plenty more. So in stingless bees, there's quite aggressive competition at flowering, at food patches. There's espionage because they use scent trails to mark the path from a nest to a feeding patch. Other bees spy out the scent trails, find the patch, and then drive away, sometimes kill their competitors. Floral food tends to be much more spatially aggregated in the tropics. It's often arboreal with thousands and thousands of flowers in one spot on a tree, and then lots of empty green space that is for bees a desert, and then another tree with again lots of flowers. Whereas in temperate habitats, at least as a tendency, it tends to be more evenly aggregated in space, evenly distributed.
On that point, there's one native group that is a black one, that Wolfson. They're just black matches, so they're trying to track females, so they're actually defend the females also about track the females that are doing it. And they are very aggressive. They're not that big, but they will take out bumblebees, dragonflies, but insects are much bigger than themselves. Flowers.
Even humans.
Yeah.
Wow.
They can't sting because they're males, but
quite strong bite.
Just take you down.
Tails, well, it's savvy.
What are they called?
Wool cardabees.
Wool cardabees.
It's remember the leaf they really like stackies, like landias.
Yeah.
Better.
Wow.
Yeah, they're very, very aggressive.
Question for both of you. Where do you draw the line between sentience and mimicry of sentience? So, and like with the legal aspects, in terms of artificial intelligence, if you've got a machine that's capable of showing what looks to be like an emotion or a feeling, sentience, if it creates property, then who owns that intellectual property? And so the bees, where is that line drawn?
So where do we draw the line for sentience, for example, in artificial intelligence, or the likelihood of it, and how does this relate to intellectual property generated by AI systems? Right? So, I mean, I think the challenge with AI systems, or one challenge, is of course that they are made to act like humans. So they pretend, and so they can look very convincingly if you ask them about how do you feel today and so on, how does it make you feel to be this lonely thing inside a machine? You provoke answers that, of course, are filled by the entire knowledge base of human emotions. And so they look very real. Now, that's cheating, because they just make it up, or at least at this stage, they're programmed to mimic human emotions. Nature doesn't have the profligacy to just make things up. So animals that display all the hallmarks of a particular emotion, say if you take a dog that in response to an injured paw will wince, will wail, will protect its paw, it will learn from the experience. You could say, well, that still doesn't prove that it's really in pain, and you would be right, that isn't proof. But adding all of these things up makes it very unlikely, unless you would actually try to make the point, well, the dog is just pretending. But why would it do that? So I think that with AI systems, a lot of what looks like sentience, I'm not ruling out the possibility that it might at some point materialize, but what we're seeing at this stage, I think, is likely just the reflections of what's been programmed into the systems. Sorry, did you want to?
I was gonna, yeah. So I think that's quite interesting what you're saying about the mimicry of sentience in AI, because, and exactly that, it is presented as something which is approximating humans. So the human remains the threshold and the objective, and largely all the hype around AI is driven by this tremendous anthropomorphism of AI and anthropocentrism of what it means to be creative, what it means to make. As far as the law is concerned at the moment, AI is not an author. If you have an example where an artificial intelligence machine spontaneously generates something, and there's no human input. So as far as the US Copyright Office is concerned, as far as the in the UK is concerned, that would not be protected because there's no human factor. But to the extent that a human does do something, so if they put in lots of prompts, so there was a comic book that went to the US Copyright Office, and they said, okay, first they said, okay, yes, we can register this, but she said this has been made by me with AI. And then they said, oh, actually, no, we can't register this, all of it, but we can register the bits that you did. But how do you distinguish that? And that's when that co-production, that collaboration question becomes quite interesting. And for the law, I think it's really fascinating to think about, okay, to what extent are the prompts original? To what extent do the prompts actually suggest that something is going to look like the way you think it will look? And in fact, then you need to look not at law, but you need to look at all of like a wealth of work on how you predict an outcome and how you imagine something is going to be as an author. But as far as the law is concerned, you don't have to know what it looks like. You can create copyright by accident as long as you're human, and it'll arise automatically. So, and as the other place, but the reason there's so much excitement about it is there's a lot of money, and especially in patent industries. So the use of artificial intelligence in patent industries is quite important, but always has been. And there are plenty of inventions that have been patented with the use of AI. But there's a lot of discussion at the moment around a particular machine. I don't know if you've heard about it, the Davos machine, which I can't remember the acronym, but it's something about sentience in the acronym. And there the courts have looked at, well, it's the Patent Act says that you have to be a natural person, and therefore you know, you can't be an inventor if you're purely AI. So if AI has generated a lunchbox all on its own, it can't be protected. But there are really important dimensions to that, because I don't believe, well, I know AI is not sentient, but as Lars says, who knows where we're getting to with this. But if we start to go, okay, you can use an AI, or an AI can make a machine, make an invention, and you can get a patent for it, but you've had nothing to do with it. But because you own the machine, you can have the patent. If AI develops sentience, that's a very alarming situation to be in. Should we not be talking about then potential welfare questions around machines? I mean, I'm not trying, this is a thought experiment. But to say that something can then all of its output becomes yours just because you own it is problematic. So as far as the law is concerned at the moment, you have to have that human input. But in the copyright context, it's actually very interesting and complicated.
Can I ask you a question? I mean, what do you think are the implications of what I've said and you've said, for ethically we view taking bee products away from them? So I think you're taking like bees wax, or the honey. I think your observation of comparing this to let's say fashion designers helping themselves to indigenous patterns is quite interesting. Actually, we had this a few years back in Mexico, when some French fashion designer sort of posed with all kinds of indigenous people. Maybe I forgot who the woman was, but anyway, so she went around all these villages and took pictures and then went away and had all their patterns manufactured somewhere in Thailand and sold them for thousands of euros, pounds, and so on. And I guess the sentiments behind that were, well, this is no one's property. We can just use that. They use it, we can use it, but we can make money with it. And so is that the same as taking a beekeeper removing comb and honey from their bees? And of course, one might, well, I would anticipate the argument that, well, as opposed to the responses from the indigenous communities, the bees don't actually feel anything when you remove their things, and whatever they do is innate. That's a little tricky, isn't it? I mean, if you take a human baby away, and you might observe, well, all the crying that their parents do is just innate. It's just reflexes. They're pre-programmed to do that. But that doesn't necessarily make it any easier. So I'm just throwing this out there. So what's...
It's interesting. There's a lot of discussion in the welfare context, and I know that Jonathan Birch spoke at one of these events recently, and he talks about this as well. But there's a lot of discussion about the basic precautionary principle in law, which is until you have evidence to the contrary, you act with caution, which basically comes from largely from environmental, but it's not just environmental law. It's kind of applied throughout, and that we don't have evidence to the contrary either. So that is the lack of evidence we should be focusing on, and we should be exercising caution with respect to the kind of suffering that the bees might endure, where they are losing part of their home, and the connection between home and sociality, I think, is also very important here. Particularly if you look at it across a whole range of species, the development of homes, as you mentioned, it is usually presents a greater degree of social competence and intelligence as well. But yeah, but of course, acting with caution is expensive. But I think that's why lots of people won't eat honey. I mean, if you're vegan, you don't eat honey, you don't and whether or not and that is largely in response to that question, but that's on the individual. And on the sentience question, I forgot to mention as well, as far as the law is concerned, it's really quite arbitrary. The distinction as to who is sentient and who is not is entirely arbitrary. There's plenty of evidence there that other species are sentient, but different pieces of legislation cut it off at different places. So cut it off at vertebrates, cut it off at vertebrates and cephalopods. Maybe we'll entertain decapods, but what would that do to scientific research? Oh, it's okay, because decapods largely, the work with decapods doesn't usually come within the sorts of things you need a license for under ASPA. And so these are the kinds of questions then that actually influence how sentience is then translated into the law. So it's arbitrary.
Yes, I'm very conscious of the time, so let's take one last question. Yeah. Please.
If we took a large number of these within the zoological taxonomies and measured their growth under math or introduction neuro, is there any indication that nature is interested in experimenting in the
So the question was, is there variation in brain size within a species? And the second question is nature interested in experimenting? Yeah. That's a very interesting question. So what variation is there between individuals of the same species? Now, for example, in bumblebees, quite a lot, because their body size varies even within one family. There's some very small ones, some larger ones. Largely, the brains of the larger bees are scaled up from the ones of smaller bees. So neuron size is smaller, and so is the entire brain. But there is variation in more subtle things than just brain size in the circuitry patterns. So, for example, we've found that there is quite a bit of variation in the learning capacities of individuals of the same colony. And this seems to be mediated by the density of synaptic complexes in the so-called mushroom bodies. These are structures in the dorsal brain that are known to be centers of multimodal integration, as well as of associative memories. And bees with a higher density of synapses, synaptic complexes in these sensory input regions of the mushroom bodies are faster learners. And as a result of that learning, that density increases further. So there is variation in the mushroom body circuitry between individuals of the same species, even the same colony, and it converts directly into appreciable differences in learning performance. All right.
Before finishing, can I ask just one quick question that you can answer very quickly if you want? So by the end of your book, you give some sort of policy recommendations to governments or individual recommendations for people about what we can do to help bees, right? And I was wondering, what do you think about rights? What do you think about extending rights, very basic rights, like the right to life, the right to freedom to bees? It is a very friendly thing nowadays in the law, extending rights to humans. And I was wondering, actually, to both of you, what do you think about this kind of extension of rights? Can these help kids? Is it something that would be helpful, a helpful framework to help these?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that the kinds of things that I have campaigned for in the past, and so has Mark here, are the more obvious things, such as generating resources for bees to feed on that is more suitable flowers, which everyone has, or everyone with access to any amount of green space has the possibility to do, which makes it a really nice thing, as opposed to, say, asking questions about conserving rainforests or iconic mammals in tropical habitats. We're fairly powerless. All we can do is donate money. But with pollinators, we can all do something meaningful right here. Should their rights change? I mean, this question is quite pertinent, for example, in laboratory settings. Many of my colleagues do invasive neuroscientific projects that are entirely unfettered at the present stage by well, any legal constraints, but also any ethical constraints, because in many cases they think it doesn't matter. And so the procedures in some cases have at least the potential to cause intense suffering. And at present, they do not have to deliver the same kinds of justifications that people working with rodents or monkeys have to do. That is some sort of consideration of knowledge gain in proportion to the severity. You do not have to justify the numbers of individuals that you're testing, no matter how severe the procedures are. You don't have to consider using analgesics. There's no constraint. And of course, there is a very clear implication, and I'm getting increasingly worried with the kinds of research that we've done, whether that sort of carefree space should continue in the same way. At present, I have not yet campaigned for any legal change because I'm trying to encourage people to just take these things seriously by, well, just considering what they could do to minimize suffering in laboratory animals and so on. But I do sometimes think that we need to have a slightly firmer hand, but I won't win many friends among my colleagues working with insect neuroscience and so on with that approach.
Yeah, I guess the question around rights is obviously has a tremendous semantic power. People relate to rights. They talk about rights. It gives them an affinity with it. That think there's something important. But of course, then we have the enforcement question, and we don't do a very good job of enforcing it in relation to humans. So, not sure that it would necessarily change anything without, as Lars says, a kind of cultural shift in the way people are dealing with insects, and in some ways putting it into people's perspectives or into their realm of perception, that it starts to look like it could matter, which is what I love about The Mind of a Bee, because it tells this wonderful story of centuries of research, but in a way that is accessible, but has the detail as well, and has the you can go and read the original papers and so forth. And towards the end, the example of the tagging bees, and people recognize bees, and it was like naming a bee. You knew the individual bee, and people getting sad when the individual bee didn't come back, because that meant that something might have happened and they didn't see them again. And I remember, and when I was reading it, I was going, I felt really, I that's what matters to our cultural shifts when it comes to as well. But I think, going back to the rights question again, I think the interesting thing here that everybody kind of understands, I'm not talking about specialists, I'm talking about the general public, is this relationship to property. If something thinks about its property, then there's something to that. And so, the dog who has a ball, who may share it with other dogs, but not all dogs, some dogs, or may let you catch it, or may not, or may pretend. This starts to then become something that people can translate into what they think. when it comes to the law, so I'm not, so I know that in animal studies, animal legal studies, there's a tension between rights and welfare. And if you talk about welfare, you might get uninvited to the Christmas party. But I teach welfare and I think about welfare, and I think about welfare in a way that maybe starts to talk about rights, because welfare means that you have certain entitlements that can't be, you can't depart from those, and that's a kind of property in itself. The beneficiaries don't have to do anything for it. They can just receive it, and that suffering has that kind of capacity. So it starts to approximate. So I start to think about where there are resonances rather than departures. But I think the ethics, so your lab culture, I think is really important here, because think about publishers. So publishers, there's a little bit of a little bit in the scientific community about there need to be better ethics statements around papers that are published. Now, why that's significant is because we could do all we like within the UK, but it won't change anything about how a research is done in another jurisdiction. But if publishers require a certain approach to ethics that must be complied with in order to publish, that creates an international regulatory framework that will matter more to advancing those standards across different, because obviously there's also the issue of research, forum, shopping, etc. And funders as well. So the interesting thing about research, so I sit on the Animals and Science Committee, and one of the things that is quite significant to think about in that context is that a lot of things, it's funded and then it gets the license. Funders don't actually have, for the most part, any questions about the ethics. That is meant to be caught by the inspectorate. Now that's an interesting question. Should there be more engagement at that stage rather than at the later stage? So there's kind of all of these, I guess, cultural elements in the research community that are potentially even more powerful. But of course, it's still research. The other thing is the 3 Rs. A lot of discussion at the moment is about going back to bees and flies. Is it replacement in the 3 Rs? You'd think that would mean replacement with a non-animal technology, but it can just mean a lower species on the hierarchy, which might be also quite arbitrary hierarchy. And so again, that's no protection. So it's kind of, yeah, it's a sort of a complicated landscape. You have.
It's to do with rights. And my view is that we actually give honeybees too many rights.
Are these the ones in hives though, or the wild?
They're the ones in hives.
Yeah, those hive bees.
I think that supposed to be these nice natural community. Yet bizarrely, it's perfectly okay for beekeepers to turn up there with 10 hives, 500,000 bees, and if I try to put, I don't know, 500,000 rodents into my food strip for their size,
Yeah.
people would be down on me like it's
Are they rights to honeybees or rights to honeybee owners?
Well, I'm talking about these because people think it's okay for the bees to be there. So we have assigned them the right to be there by putting them in there.
Yeah.
You've got the right to use this for forget about all the other ones that are there.
Yeah. But I think it's more like when people say you've got the right to put your cattle on the common.
Well,
The cattle have no rights.
Well, yes, they have, because we've said, you know, your
But what if the farmer comes up and says, you've had enough grass now you're a steak? It's a lot of a cow. Yeah, I think what's interesting there is, I think really what we're looking at is the interests of the owner, and the animal is just a resource in that scenario, and it's not really rights, and everything that they are enjoying or doing can be terminated at any point. It's really about how the farmer is managing their resource. So there's no more protection for those bees than say in a slaughterhouse.
There's just been a big case in the US exactly on this issue. So I'm an ecologist, I'm also a beekeeper. I'm always an ecologist before I'm a beekeeper. But I agree with you. We should be putting managed bees on native birds.
Yeah.
There's a massive difference between managed honeybees and wild free-living colonies. So wild free-living colony is going to consume about 0.02% of the raw resources with a 100 radius of it.
Yeah.
Whereas a managed colony, be manipulated to be bigger, be more productive, is consuming about 4.5%.
And you mentioned that too.
Of the raw resources.
Exactly.
Then they're a completely different animal. We've selectively bred honeybees, we've managed them, they're
Yeah.
completely different animals to a free living wild colony. So I agree that we shouldn't put an interest in it. There's just been a big massive case in the autumn in North America. There's a beekeeper in North America. He's got something like 37,000 colonies, and every year he kind of migrates them all over the continent for different pollination contracts, and then he takes them to the Midwest, to the prairies, over winter, and they go there in late summer. And the idea is he wants quality foraging habitats. These bees can recover from being moved all over the country, being fed one close to one close to one.
And it wipes out the local.
Being exposed to a cocktail of different chemicals and they get taken to these resting places in the Midwest and by their thousands, so they can rest up and then feed, build up their stores over winter. And this sort of conservation of America had enough of it that said this is not acceptable. We've got native bees like Promus affinis, which are at risk of extinction.
Yeah.
And they're at risk of extinction because you spread bee pathogens around, by moving bees.
Exactly.
So there's been this big massive test case in America and they were kind of arguing. And I'm not quite sure what happened. There's a big debate about do honeybees have rights to these natural resources, and do beekeepers have rights to them as well?
And there was the news that just came of CNN or something about the honeybee colony collapses over, or the bee colony collapses over, and then when you dig down, it's actually just all these farm bees, and it's not counting. And they said it's actually quite artificial, and it's more of a problem. So it's
not a conservation suit.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. And they said we're not counting wild bees. We're actually counting colonies in Texas. And it's and again, that's part of that communication then to the public, and they are seeing something different and thinking something different. Like all the people who think, oh, I'm going to get a beehive and put it on my roof, forgetting what that might, well, not knowing what that, not forgetting, not actually knowing what that might mean. And again, I'm sorry, I'm fangirling a bit about the book, but getting this out to people, like it's so exciting to read about the mind of a bee. And if people hopefully are reading this book and they're starting to think differently about, okay, I'm not going to put a hive on my roof, I'm just going to make sure I have some more decent flowers and some indigenous species, not these silly big camellias or whatever it is.
Yeah,
Don't feed bees.
That's a good point to wrap up with an invitation to read The Mind of a Bee.
Yes.
So thank you so much both for a fascinating conversation and discussion. Before finishing, I invite you to join us next week. We are going to have a conversation about AI and global governance. So you are very welcome. Today we have discussed a little bit about the similarities and differences between animals' minds and AI minds. So maybe we can continue the conversation next week. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for the organization.
Thank you. It's a fascinating.
All right.
Really love reading.
And if anyone would like a copy of the book, I still got a few.